I just need a confirmation from the tech team that our virtual speakers, the speakers who are joining us virtually, they're online. Okay, great. Yeah, so we want to start. If you don't mind, please have a seat so we can start this discussion. Our speakers joining us through a video conference, they're waiting for us to start. Thank you so much. So I hope you all have enjoyed the discussions today as much as I have. The next discussion is titled Energy Security in East Asia. Before I introduce our moderator for this discussion, please allow me once again to acknowledge and thank particularly two of our sponsors for this conference, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and also Gowling WLG. So the next panel, as I said, is titled Energy Security in East Asia. We have Thomas Timmins to moderate this discussion for us. Thank you, Tom, for being here. Thank you for your support from Gowling WLG as well. Tom is a senior corporate commercial lawyer serving clients in power, infrastructure, and advanced manufacturing. With more than 20 years of experience, he's sought out for his intimate knowledge of the power sector and his ability to help get complex, challenging projects across the finish line. Tom leads Gowling WLG Canada's energy sector group and is a member of the firm's China executive leadership team. Tom also serves as a member of the advisory board of Centre for Urban Energy at Metropolitan Toronto University and as an adjunct professor of law at Windsor Law. His full bio is available on the website of the conference website, easf2022.org. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists and Tom Timmins, our moderator for this discussion.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for being here. I realize this is the graveyard shift, you have the right at 6:15 to stand up and wave your hands if you wish. I know I'm standing between you and cold beer. Can our panelists virtually hear me okay? Everything all right? Okay, good. Unbelievable. That's terrific. That's a step in the right direction. So I'm Tom Timmins. I lead energy at Gowling WLG. Those of you who don't know what Gowling WLG is, we're a Canadian law firm. We're one of the largest Canadian law firms. We're in fact one of the largest Canadian law firms, one of the largest law firms on earth, believe it or not. And we started just a few blocks away from here in Ottawa about 150 years ago, believe it or not. So we at Gowlings, of course, are very close to the private sector, and we work very closely with a lot of the different players in the energy space, and we can attest that this is one of the most challenging points in the history of energy, particularly for Asia and Asian countries and Asian leaders and people in Asia. Now, the description of the panel says that it's potentially has never been as fraught. I would argue it may have been as fraught or as complex during the Suez crisis, but things are certainly complicated now, and Canada has a role to play. I'm delighted to be joined in person by my co-panelist, Rachel Zemba, adjunct senior fellow, Energy Economics and Security program at the Center for New American Security. And then online, we're joined by Mikhail Maiden, Director, Gas Research Program and Director, China Energy Program from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. And Kasuke Sadamori, Director, Energy Markets and Security Directorate at the International Energy Agency. And then last but certainly not least, Lisa Baton, the President and CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Mikhail, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. I want to ask you a little bit about really what the war in Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine, what the implication has been for East Asia's energy markets to date, and maybe you can share your initial thoughts on that, and then we'll go to some of our other speakers.
Thanks, Tom. And I think these will be initial thoughts because it's hugely complex and quite varied. Right, the implications of the market volatility following the sanctions have been devastating for many South Asian countries. But as I said, the picture varies widely across the region because exposure to Russian flows of oil, gas, and coal varies by country. The vulnerability and exposure to spot markets, especially for LNG, again, is very different. Some countries have oil-indexed contracts and some countries rely less on spot volumes. China has faced an economic slowdown this year that has actually limited its appetite for energy imports and has arguably come to the rescue or slightly eased some of the tightness in gas, oil, and coal markets. Sort of on the flip side of that, and I think it's easy to qualify everybody as losers in this situation. It's really hard to talk about winners. China and India have picked up discounted cargoes of oil, some rerouted gas, and some coal. And I think, we can talk a lot about how trade flows shift and how markets optimize, because that's what they do. But I think there's a bigger question, which is, I don't know, existential is probably too big a word, but a question of, especially in the eyes of developing countries, how the West has outsourced its supply insecurity onto developing economies and really rendered energy supplies more complicated and prohibitive for some countries. And I think it's interesting for us to discuss, and as a question is sort of whether these geopolitical fault lines are going to be redrawn now, and to what extent they will end up shaping and impacting markets. And maybe a final point is really that energy security has risen on the policy agenda everywhere. But again, the responses are very different. It's easy to say coal has made a comeback. Certainly, coal is a response for many emerging countries. In China, we hear a lot about how coal has been the answer. But I would caution a little bit that, yes, coal production in China has certainly grown this year. And that's a response to the power outages that they've had last year, more than to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would argue. But also renewable capacity additions have almost been double that of coal-fired generation. So I think we have to be careful about oversimplifying the solutions. Certainly, again, there's a return of coal, but we can accelerate the energy transition, I think, if policies and support are there. But, again, for China, energy security has been in kind of all of the above response, but that's because it can. And I'd like to just end by saying, and again, I think this is something for us to unpack, that I think the divide between the energy sort of haves and have-nots is likely to widen and increase. And that is perhaps something that governments, corporates, industry has to try and work to prevent. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Nicole. That's a terrific opening. Kaseki, I'm going to come to you next. Yesterday in the FT, we saw a quote from Masahiro Okajuji from Itochu telling us that Japan actually couldn't completely extract itself from Russian oil. Is that true, do you think? Is there a broader question? Are the East Asian countries able to pivot here, given the uncertainty that they're facing? Are there infrastructural challenges? Any thoughts to share?
Well, I agree that the Russian the oil and gas resources, they are crucially important for Japan, at least, because the Japan depends about 9% on natural gas from Russia, and in the case of oil, it's about 4 or 5%, I recall. So that the Russian oil and gas resources are very important for Japan. In terms of one of the kind of the import sources, and also diversification. In the case of oil, Japan depends so much on the Middle East, so they wanted to diversify the import regions, and Russia is one of the answers to that. But now Russia is becoming a real problem. So in that respect, Japan needs to import at least to a certain extent, even though the US or Canada, they imported totally the Russian oil and gas, and also Europe is going to implement the total ban, the ban of the kind of seaborne oil imports from Russia from December for crude, and also February in products, and so this may have some another complications to the world oil flow. And we are not certain about the kind of systems of the proposed oil price cap by the G7 countries. So there's an enormous uncertainty to that. But as the previous speaker said, in terms of the oil flow, we have seen a very drastic change. So now the India, they were importing very little from Russia at the beginning of this year, but now they are one of the major importers of Russian oil. They import around 1 million barrels per day. And also China and Turkey increased their imports from Russia. So we have yet to see what would happen to the oil flow after the kind of system changes in December. Natural gas, of course, is the most affected sector product. And we have seen massive the surge in LNG imports to Europe as a response to the lack of Russian natural gas, and that suck up the enormous amount of spot LNG cargoes away from Asia. So Pakistan, the countries like India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, they are in trouble in terms of lack of access to the affordable the natural gas, and so that's what is happening in the aftermath of the Russian-Ukraine crisis.
Thank you, Kasega. You mentioned a really good point. A number of countries, including allies, are in trouble, or they will be in trouble in the coming months if things don't change. Maybe Rachel, I can come to you next. How do you think these countries can respond, or what if you were, advising one of these governments? What would you recommend?
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. And nice to have an excuse to come back to Ottawa. So I think just to sort of step. Sorry, thank you. I think just to step back, one thing to sort of highlight and reinforce in thinking about it, I guess two elements. One is just to highlight that there's a lot more oil and natural gas being transported via ship instead of via pipelines at a global level. Now, this is perhaps a little less relevant for Asia Pacific, but given that this is, in a sense, an energy crisis and redirection of flows around the globe, and to pick up on Mikhail's sort of point earlier about the outsourcing of some of the energy crisis, in a sense, what's happened as European entities have become much more reliant on both seaborne crude, but also especially seaborne LNG, that has put more pressure on, and if anything, maybe globalize that LNG market more. It's the kind of thing for years we talk about that. It varies a lot, of course, country by country and across the commodity channels, but I think that becomes very important, that more sort of higher proportions by sea, because if anything, where we're headed with the combination of embargo and perhaps G7 price cap is towards something that is going to put more emphasis and focus on which parts of the fleet, which tankers are being used, do they have insurance from whom, and we're probably likely to see that both transit times are going to get longer to get the sort of fossil fuels to their destination, and they might have intermediate destinations along the way. We're already seeing sort of more oil, whether it's coming from Russia or coming from Iran, going to Southeast Asian countries who are reselling it. Malaysia now is selling more oil to China than Malaysia produces by a sizable margin. That's probably only going to increase. Same thing with the UAE. So some of the factors in thinking about also just transportation costs of getting the fuel to Asia are likely to increase. So that's one element. The other is, and my co-panelists have nicely sort of set out some of the short-term and some long-term implications, but I think if anything, we're maybe now, there's been a dynamic at a global level where there's been so much focus on that short-term scramble, particularly in Europe. And some elements, especially if things stay warm, where Europe might sort of make it through, which is maybe something we were more worried about some months ago. But there's a lot of medium term looking out between now and when additional natural gas supplies will come online. Dynamics that are sort of not necessarily being addressed. And of course, all of this environment makes it even more difficult to think about longer term energy choices. So I think the advice that I would give, and it depends, which country, but I mean, I do work with some large companies in the region, especially in Japan, has been to be aware that the costs, associated compliance costs and due diligence of where their fuel is being sourced from is likely to become more complicated. I hear as well what Kaisuke sort of highlighted, and that the sort of importance for Japanese companies, their Russian investments, and I don't think we've quite sort of thought through what over the longer term Russia's role might be. I think we look from a sanctions perspective and the like, that even in the very unlikely event there was some kind of resolution we all could live with, a lot of these measures, economic measures, might remain in place for a long period of time. And what's that going to mean for very future global energy sort of supplies? But overall, I guess that the last thing I'd sort of leave one with, and this is maybe goes back to the comment about developing countries in the region. This is a panel talking about energy security, but I think it's hard not to also think about the coincidence hit to food security. Both through the link of commodities like fertilizer, much of which relies on natural gas or other energy inputs as an input. And of course, fertilizer shortages and dislocations can increase the cost of food in the region as well as in the globe, but also because some of the countries that are most vulnerable to energy supply shortages and the like also are being hit at the same time. They have higher food weights in their baskets. And I'm thinking about South Asian countries, some Southeast Asian countries. And of course, this is happening also at the same time where across the region, and to some extent in Europe and Africa, this is coming at a time when currencies are weakening against the US dollar. So even commodities like oil that might not have gone up that much in US dollar terms have gone up in local currency terms. So there's a number of factors here. And for the richer countries in the region, of course, there may be more scope for development aid, assistance, thinking about debt restructuring and the like. But for some of the others, I think thinking about what are the sort of sustainable ways of balancing out the cost for the population? And maybe we'll come back to subsidies or not later in the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Great comments, and thank you for raising the question of food security, because just to remind everyone in the room, like energy impacts not just, how we move, it impacts how we light our homes, how we cool our homes, how we heat our homes. It impacts food directly. And these things reach right into the home and have a direct impact on the populace. And it even impacts things like literacy and birth rates, as that, we saw that in the United States in the 50s and in India in the 70s. And so this is a crucial question. And it is, as this percolates through the system, we are going to see less, it is going to impact the stability of a lot of these economies and a lot of these countries. So, Lisa, I want to come to you. Have you seen, what have you seen in terms of overall responses from countries in Asia beginning to grapple with this? Any thoughts to share?
Sure. I think as all of my panelists have conveyed, this is a really complex and varied issue. And there's no kind of one-size-fits-all answer to energy security. So maybe let me provide some comments on the Canadian perspective and what Canada can do to help foster energy security in East Asia. And in that regard, Canada is in a strong position to help East Asian countries offset their dependence on Russian energy supplies, particularly in helping meet demand for LNG. First, we have the resources. Canada, people may not know, is the 6th largest natural gas producer in the world. And we have some of the most affordable natural gas production on the planet. And we also have oil reserves that surpass Russia's. Second, we have efficient transportation routes. We've talked about seaborne crude and LNG. It is about half the distance from Canada's northwest coast to Japan when you compare that to the US Gulf Coast. So this has a bearing on the cost of shipping LNG to East Asia and related GHG emissions. Third, Canada produces some of the lowest emission natural gas and LNG in the world. Because of our flaring and venting practices, Canada natural gas production emits less methane compared to other jurisdictions. And due to our colder climate, it really takes less energy to cool natural gas and liquefy it for shipping. So this means using Canadian LNG in East Asia, even compared to using Russian natural gas, will lower GHG emissions and has the potential to offset the use of dirtier forms of energy. But, perhaps most noteworthy, in just a couple of short years, LNG Canada will begin operations in 2025 with Japan and Korea being two major investors in the project as well as major customers. In addition, the smaller wood fiber LNG facility on the Canadian West Coast is also nearing the construction phase. So there's a lot of opportunity for LNG on Canada's West Coast. And I would just add that in terms of, addressing East Asian energy security and having Canada be part of the solution on that, it'll be really important for governments in East Asia to not only to work with our industry, but to work with federal and provincial governments here in Canada to make sure that we can expedite additional projects. So in doing so, we can take on a larger role in protecting East Asian energy security and contributing to global energy security, again, while lowering GHG emissions.
Thank you, Lisa. Before we start to drill down on Canada's role, I just want to see if any of our panelists can help us understand what East Asian countries have started doing in relation to the energy transition. Of course, the hoofbeat that we can hear in the background is climate change, and then the other kind of drumbeat that we might hear is something called Swanson's cost curve, where solar is continuing to decline in cost every year, year after year after year. So both huge threats to the traditional oil and gas industries. What are the East Asian countries beginning to do, and what have they accomplished, and where are they going when it comes to responding to the energy transition? Because the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Western Europe, has, to some extent, underscored the need for the energy transition. Kosuke, maybe I could start with you, and then we'll come to you, Mikkel, if that's okay.
I think that it depends on the countries. For instance, Japan, one of the major steps that they have taken is the announcement of the use of more nuclear power in the Japanese systems. So the Prime Minister Kishida announced very clearly that they intend to restart the existing nuclear power plants for those who received the safety approvals from the nuclear authority. And this would surely, if it happens, then it would surely reduce the LNG import requirements for Japan. Then the cargo can be redirected to the region in more dire needs. And I understand that the Korea also kind of with the new administration, changed their policies toward the more use of nuclear. So diversification away from the fossil fuels. And of course, it's not only the nuclear, but also they're trying to expand the renewables, the wind and solar. So that would help. But in terms of the real short term, the energy diversification, of course, the starting nuclear power plants, that would have a very massive impact because restarting one reactor would lead to around 1 million tons of LNG per year. So that's a very important element to that. And as for China, of course, they have announced a very ambitious the decarbonization targets, and the growth in renewables, both in solar and wind, is quite massive, actually. They are leading the world by providing about 40% of the global additional renewable capacity every year. But still, it's not enough to replace the power generation requirements. And that's the reason why they started burning more coal from the second half of last year, I remember. And so, of course, China is trying to kind of diversify and use all the resources, but still, the energy demand growth is quite large. But unfortunately or fortunately, the last year or so far this year, the China's the energy demand has not grown due to this the COVID related restrictive measures by the government. But if China goes out of this the COVID restrictions and come back to the ordinary growth path of the energy demand, then the whole world will be in trouble in terms of because that will lead to the kind of a competition to the limited resources, in particular the natural gas. So in that respect, the outlook for next year is even more uncertain with this potential Chinese growth.
Thank you, Katsuki. Mikhail, if I can come to you.
Yeah, I mean, Keisuke-san has just said it. It's been interesting to see that Chinese economic growth has been weak this year and emissions have fallen. But if and as China recovers from zero COVID policy, and to be fair, there's no end in sight to zero COVID just yet, but a lot will depend on how China chooses to continue to grow, because there is a correlation between economic activity and coal demand. Having said that, China's been very actively thinking about the energy transition. President Xi Jinping issued the 2060 carbon neutrality pledge back in 2020. I think that was a very important moment in the Chinese bureaucracy. I mean, that statement, I think, caught a lot of people within China off guard, but that has really set forward a conversation and a scramble, I think, by the bureaucracy on how to get, what is the roadmap to energy to net zero. So the target is set. We don't know, and much like many other countries, how to get there. The issue for China is, of course, how to move away from coal, which represents 55% of the energy mix, and to introduce more renewables. Oil and gas, I mean, oil is 19% of the energy mix, gas is only 9%. But there has been a lot of long-term thinking. The Chinese government has an ambitious electrification program, and China is also the leader in electric vehicles in deployment, but also in manufacturing of batteries, which this is a program that started close to 20 years ago, in part in order to address energy security and to limit China's reliance on imported oil. Now, electrification is good if the power sector is decarbonized, but China is building more renewable capacity. And I think the strength of China's kind of low carbon transition stems from the fact that it aligns with a number of policies, and first and foremost, industrial policy. Leading in the industries of the future is a clear industrial goal for the Chinese leadership. We heard it again in the 20th Party Congress, reiterated how China needs to lead in sort of modern technologies and innovation. There's also, I think, a nexus with food security that means that, again, China will pursue the low carbon transition, not necessarily for climate change purposes, but because there are other interests at stake. And so the response is really all of the above. There's nuclear, there's hydro, renewables, a focus on energy storage. Gas is seen as part of the transition in China, and so its role is likely to grow. But again, with China, the numbers matter, right? It's 9% of the energy mix now, and at best, it will probably reach 15% of the energy mix in a decade or so. And that now seems optimistic with the kind of slowdown that we've seen. It's tiny within the China kind of energy mix, but a 15% share would mean that we get another 300 BCM or so of incremental demand over the next decade, so that's hugely meaningful for global gas markets. Just one last thing, I think it's interesting to note that when China thinks about energy security, the thinking has changed quite a bit. I mean, in the last statements and in policy plans, there really is a talk about system-wide resilience, again, in line with the energy transition and the need to have this systemic transformation. The 20th Party Congress really highlighted how the West is a threat to China. Western sanctions, those have been one of the biggest disruptors for flows to China, although they haven't led to supply shortages. And really, supply shortages in China have been because of domestic price controls and domestic policies. So clearly there are institutional and structural issues that China needs to deal with, but the perception is very much that energy security is something that's created by the West, not by the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Thanks, Mikhail. Lots to unpack there. Maybe I'll go to you, Rachel, on some thoughts regarding the energy transition.
Sure. I just wanted to highlight that as some of the countries in Asia, as they are looking to cushion the impact of rising and volatile energy prices on their consumers, are taking the opportunity not only to subsidize or sort of provide some cushion on the fossil fuel side to refiners and the like, but also, for example, Japan planning to provide more funds to sort of support feed-in tariffs and other things to allow more sort of rollout of renewable capacity, and the like, others in that way. I also think there's interesting questions ahead in a number of mining companies and countries, as there are, here in Canada, as one thinks about energy security expanding to think about critical mineral supply chains and those needed for batteries. There was maybe a little more sensational than, sort of baked sort of speculation in the FT, I think, today about what Indonesia might be doing on nickel, and was it creating an OPEC-like structure? Clearly, if it hasn't thought about what point of sort of the processing channel that would take place. But they are definitely interested in both adding value and processing of these critical minerals, and there's a lot of questions about whether they might work with foreign partners in a different way. And you could say the same thing about some of the producers outside the region in critical minerals. I'm thinking about places like Bolivia and elsewhere in Latin America. And so that sort of importance of the inputs into batteries, I think, is made, and I say this as somebody who spent a lot of career sort of focusing on fossil fuel energy security. We have all sorts of new countries and transport channels to sort of think about in a different way as we sort of roll out. So that element of, to the extent that there is funding, sort of there are more countries in the region that I think are doing this, all of the above. The other thing, I think, just to sort of put some more meat on something Mikhail said, on sort of China's role in natural gas. I mentioned earlier that some countries, especially those outside Asia, were maybe not linking their short-term response to the medium and long-term. I'm pointing a finger maybe at European countries. But where China's concerned, one of the things that continues to be interesting is this long-term contracting and purchasing of LNG, particularly from the United States. Obviously some interest perhaps in that, sort of from Canada. And that has continued and maybe been a bit of a bright spot in China-US relations, that those sort of commercial contracts. Now, those are supplies that come online over the next several years, right? They're not on the sort of table today. And as many of us have noted, this weakening, this slack in demand from China has meant they've been able to sort of resell those supplies. But that element still of all of the, sort of all of the above seems to be present in a number of countries in the region. And if anything, maybe there's been a bit of a pushback here, as in the Middle East, of maybe what we're seen as too aggressive energy transition goals from perhaps the Europeans.
Interesting. Opportunity for Canada. So friendly, harmless Canada, well-located Canada. We, of course, have oil and gas. We have a lot of these strategic minerals, and we don't have too much of a colonial legacy. We're, mid-sized country. We're relatively friendly. Where do we fit in? Lisa, maybe I'll come to you, and I think I know what your answer is going to be. So before, maybe I'll add a little bit of a spin on the pitch. If Canada is going to be providing oil and gas to our Asian neighbors and friends, how do we align that with our climate change commitments? And
Well, let me first say that the energy transition is probably one of the most important issues we're facing. It's also the easiest to get wrong, and it's going to require pragmatism and compromise. We need to address the real energy needs today and investment, and we need to adapt to cleaner ways of producing our energy for tomorrow. We have my fellow panel member is from the IEA, and we watch IEA global energy forecasts very, very closely. The most recent IEA World Energy Outlook reinforces the overlapping challenge of maintaining energy security while transitioning to a lower emissions energy mix. It shows the global market for oil and natural gas will become increasingly competitive. And we cannot just simply cede the market to less responsible suppliers. If I look at the IEA's 2022 STEPS scenario, North American oil and natural gas exports to Europe are expected to increase 90% and to Asia by 170% by 2030 to enable a reduction in reliance on Russian resources. So investing in the growth of lower emission oil and natural gas and getting it efficiently to international markets remains paramount for our producers, and to make sure we're not slipping back into reliance on less secure suppliers. And the way we can do that, Canada is rapidly developing our capacity to get our resources to international markets. That means both expanding energy, that would mean expanding our energy transportation infrastructure and our LNG trading infrastructure. And it also facilitating growth in the North American trading capacity. Either way, Canada is playing a bigger role in meeting global energy demand. And just to conclude on to your question, Canadian producers probably have some of the best global thought leadership on GHG emission reducing innovation and technology here in Canada. And they are actively working to take the carbon out of their production, and they will continue to progress on that path.
Thank you, Lisa. None of this is easy, right? And we've known that I've dedicated my entire career to this topic, it was actually really great to see in the newspaper, really for the first time, the IEA announcement this week about the idea that we're actually potentially going to be hitting a cap in terms of global GHG emissions in 2025. I hope for all of us and for all of our children's sake that that's true. Kaseke, maybe I'll come to you and ask you, how do the timelines look in terms of the energy transition in Asia? Will Asian countries achieve it before? Of course, we have a far higher carbon footprint here in Canada than virtually any Asian country that I know of. But how do the timelines look from your perspective in terms of the energy transition?
I think that we need to be aware of the differences in timelines between the emerging Asian economies, which are still growing quite rapidly, and also their population is growing still. So we cannot kind of consider the energy transitions in the emerging Asian regions just like what's happening in Europe or even North America, I think. So that's something that we need to bear in mind. So we need to make sure that their increasing energy demand would be met in a secure and affordable way. So that's something that we need to consider. So in that respect, I think that the exporting regions like Canada or the United States would be very important to satisfy the growing energy demand. And there was a reference to the IEA's, the World Energy Outlook 2022. And the scenario that you mentioned, that Lisa mentioned, was the steps, what we call the steps, which is basically the scenario, the assuming that the current policy ambitions of the government would be maintained. So if the government turns to stronger kind of policy measures in terms of kind of dealing with the climate change, the things would be different. Now, in terms of the both achieving the sustainability requirement and energy security, I think that there's a lot that the oil and gas producers need to do. In particular, the methane leakage is a serious issue in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. But in the IEA's analysis, nearly half of the methane leakage can be dealt with zero net costs, because captured gas can be sold to the market. And because we are seeing the high natural gas prices, then that means that many of the capturing methane leaks actually pays. So I think that's one of the very important elements, for instance, in terms of having kind of short-term impacts in terms of the lower greenhouse gas emissions, but also contributing to the energy security. And I think that's one of the important points that I would like to mention here. Thanks.
Thank you, Kaseke. Mikhail, maybe I can come to you in terms of the overall timeline. How do things look from your perspective in terms of the energy transition in Asia?
I mean, I'll focus again on China. Obviously, the pledge that Xi Jinping made in 2020 was what's known the 30-60 pledge. So to peak carbon emissions before 2030 and to reach net zero by 2060. I think 2030, before 2030 is easy to reach for China. The question is how early. There used to be talk before the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the volatility in global markets that China could peak its emissions before 2027. That is now off the discussion. It might still be sort of discussed internally in China, but it's no longer discussed more publicly. And of course, China has not set an absolute peak on emissions. And so there's scope for emissions to increase. There's only sort of the ambition is for them to peak, not at any absolute level and then to fall. So there is a risk that emissions peak at a very high level and then sort of falling from there is a bit easier. You said that none of the East Asian countries are or sort of there are very few East Asian countries whose carbon footprint is larger than Canada. Well, China certainly is. Its carbon footprint is larger than any other country in terms of CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. Cumulative emissions are second only to the US. Per capita emissions, also second only to the US. So there is no solution to climate change without China. Now, having said that, I often hear corporates and other governments saying, if China's not going to fix it, then why should we do anything? Obviously, I think we all need to be part of the solution, and certainly China. To go back to the timelines, again, 2030, it's a question of how early and how much. 2060, I think, is likely because the Chinese governments sort of rarely issue targets that they cannot meet. It's a question of how. And I think there's also a question of, is it more on the supply side and the demand side? This is also a question that I think is relevant for a lot of emerging economies. Certainly in the West, we're focused on greening our supplies and kind of replicating our way of life, but just greening it, when there's a lot that should be done on the demand side. We shouldn't be consuming the way we are. We shouldn't be flying as much as we are. We shouldn't be eating whatever avocados from Mexico in London. All of these things are not talked about, but they're equally important. And they are an open question, both for China and for other emerging economies. Just one final note on the timelines. I think these questions of technological decoupling and geopolitical kind of fracturing are a huge risk, especially as we talk about China. Rachel talked about new materials and new material supplies. Certainly in Europe, there's a sense that, China is potentially the new Russia and that Europe is at risk of replacing its reliance on Russian gas with a reliance on Chinese new energy materials and new energy supplies, which in kind of military circles could caution against the energy transition. And that is a very, I think, problematic way of looking at the energy transition. These kind of discussions of friendshoring and reshoring, I think they risk setting us back in terms of the time, and we have no time for the energy transition. Certainly we need diversification. Keisuke-san will know more about this than all of us. We need diversification and diversity in everything. I think it is premature to exclude China from supply chains, certainly again, while we need to diversify. But in terms of timelines, China is very much on track, but it does need Western inputs and Western interactions. And I think we should all be very careful about overplaying geopolitical tensions because, again, they could slow down the energy transition globally.
Thank you. An excellent point. Anything to add, Rachel?
I don't have much to add on the specific timelines, but just to sort of pick up on that point about technological decoupling and other coercive policies, in addition to the specific case that Mikhail is, or the broad case that Mikhail is talking about, I would note it hasn't happened yet, but one of the things sort of on the radar for additional areas that the U.S. might sort of look to expand either export controls, but especially outbound investment screening or notification are high-capacity batteries. Which of course, sort of both, G7 and a variety of other, sort of thinking about that, but a lot of the battery technology, for example, in Europe and in developed Asia, very reliant on China. So something to watch, because clearly batteries are going to be part of the solution and more technological innovation. This is very much not my field, so I can defer to others on the panel. But that question mark about sort of deployment and the like, also still interesting and open question You've had sort of you've had some relocation of sort of solar sort of trade diversion of solar panels, some processing in Southeast Asia, in part to skirt sort of U.S. tariffs, but also to kind of address some of the sanctions that were in place to restrict economic access that is undermining that is to send a message about the treatment of the Uyghurs. There's sort of been some relaxation in practice of some of that, but I think there are a number of areas where there's a question, in a sense, because of potential U.S. extraterritorial application of policies that can impact at the global level. I guess I'm also going to be watching. I think I'm probably not the only one that probably has low expectations about what might happen at COP27 that is starting, later this week. But I do know that there are probably some other Asian countries and those that are beyond the scope of the Indo-Pacific, those in Central Asia and the like, that might be rolling out sort of new targets. So I'll be watching closely for that. But I think at this point, especially in a context where their funding is delayed and most of it is focused on maybe low-cost technology transfer, I think there's a lot of risk that this sort of short-term economic stabilization and energy stabilization makes it harder to focus on those longer-term goals.
That's an excellent.
But now I'm being a downer.
No. That's an excellent point. The distinction between short and medium and long term. Of course, short term is in many ways the world that we live in, I guess one question I want to throw out to the panel, and I do want to open it up for questions from the audience, but has Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine, how has that, in your view, impacted the energy transition? Maybe, Lisa, I'll start with you. Has Ukraine sped up the energy transition, slowed it down? Is it going to have a neutral impact? I know this is obviously almost impossible to predict, but I'm just interested in what your thoughts are.
Well, I think it certainly has brought a sharper focus on the need for a more pragmatic and thoughtful approach to how interconnected all of these issues are. I think we chatted earlier about energy security and its tentacles. Energy security is the foundational pillar of all things we've come to take for granted, whether that is our national or continental security, our economic security, or our food security. And even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were reaching a crisis in energy security and supply. What I would probably say is that it has brought a more pragmatic and the need for a more thoughtful and pragmatic and holistic approach to how we are approaching all of these issues. And I would just say, from my perspective, these aren't either or choices. We can tackle these challenges concurrently. But it has become increasingly clear that there's no switch to rapidly turn off our reliance on hydrocarbons. To your last question, one thing that hasn't really been discussed is the fact that the industry is going to be a critical piece of the puzzle in the energy transition. The innovation and technology that is happening in the industry to take carbon out of the production. So I guess I would just say we really have to, pull up, look at these challenges on a global scale, and and it's not an either or choice.
I think you're making an excellent point, Lisa, in terms of there was a great piece in the Globe on that, I think it was on this weekend, about everything that's taking place in Alberta in terms of the energy transition, and it is actually quite incredible. Kasuke, any views in terms of whether Ukraine is going to speed up or slow down the energy transition globally?
I believe that it surely is accelerating the clean energy transitions, decarbonization of the world. Of course, as Michelle pointed out, there are some the switching back to coal, and some countries are burning more coal, and they're also kind of struggling to get the the fossil fuel supplies. So there seems to be some kind of going backwards. But if we see the kind of policy actions by the governments, the European Union repowering EU, and also in the US, it's Inflation Reduction Act. And there are similar movements in the governments try to accelerate, because now the energy transitions, decarbonization of the kind of energy systems is not only about the climate change mitigation, but it's about the serious energy security matter. So there are some countries in Europe, for instance, even Germany, decided to use nuclear at least for a while, and Belgium also extended, kind of postponed the decommissioning of the nuclear power plants, and also they are trying to actually accelerate by speeding up the kind of the approval processes, and also the putting additional incentives for the renewables, energy efficiency, and also the kind of the further advanced low carbon technologies like hydrogen or the use of ammonia. So in that respect, I think that there may be some short-term kind of the backtracking, but overall, I think that this incident surely accelerate the kind of a low carbon clean energy transitions.
Very interesting. Over to you, Rachel, and I'm hoping you can also maybe talk to us a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act as well, and maybe how that's going to play out in your view.
Sure. So I think before getting to that, I think it's also can be helpful here to think about what might be the policies that help get us more to that element. I mean, I was alluding earlier to subsidies, and while we're far from the kind of degree of fuel subsidies that were present in Asia, especially developed Asia, a decade and a half ago, it's understandable that a lot of governments in Asia and around the world have either cut taxes on, sort of excise taxes on fuel, or sort of tried to do what they can to sort of lessen the impact on consumers. But it's important to both do that in a way that doesn't create shortages because the sort of, whether it's the refiners or the power utilities aren't getting the money they need to purchase, so sort of to produce the supplies needed. I think there were a lot of lessons learned from a decade or so ago, both in Asia, but as I say, also around the world. But the reason of being wary about subsidies is also that the risk is that it doesn't actually adjust consumption. And again, so we're sort of back to this short term, sort of longer term, but it also might be interesting to see to what extent some of things like reducing the lighting in public buildings that is going on both in some Asian countries, but especially in Europe. One wonders if that might become more permanent. Whether efficiencies, especially in more developed countries with existing stock, improvements that reduce the leakage, can be, real sort of consumption gainers. So there's a set of policies that can reinforce it. I mean, yes, there are some measures in the Inflation Reduction Act which both encourage retrofitting and the like, but also continue to encourage, installation of renewable sort of technology. There's still interesting questions, of course, there, and more generally, even in things like the CHIPS Act, which was mostly focused on semiconductors, but also more broadly involved increases in spending on basic research and STEM, expanding what the National Science Foundation could give in grants. And I think some of that will also reverberate in ways that could be beneficial for the energy transition.
Okay, that's great. If there are any questions from the audience, I'm going to ask that you use the microphone and, as earlier, introduce yourselves. Before we go to that, one more question for you, Mikhail. In terms of Canada and China, what do you see the opportunities there for Canadian investors and Canadian government leaders in terms of the China-Canada relationship?
Now that it's finally thawed.
Yeah, a little bit. It can only get better. That's what we were saying a couple of years ago. So.
Look, hopefully, I think, again, the Party Congress speech, the work report, and everything that's coming out of China does suggest that it is extremely cautious about the external environment, to the extent that Canada is not seen as a proxy of the US or as or is perceived as a friendly country, I think that would certainly be helpful. But beyond friendly or unfriendly, there is the availability of resources and the ability to supply China with all the fossil fuels and all the materials that it will need for its energy transition. I do think that for Canada, taking a lead on reporting, measurement, and verification of methane emissions from its oil and gas, from the upstream, sort of from the wellhead to the transport, will place it as a global leader because that is what needs to happen. Asian buyers are becoming increasingly conscious about the carbon, and not just the carbon, but the greenhouse gas footprint and content of their imports. So if Canada can demonstrate, and again, really measure and verify that it is a leader in terms of greenhouse gas or in terms of the carbon footprint, that will certainly put it in good stride. I mean, if you look at future gas balances in China, on the supply side, geopolitically, it's not looking great for China. If we assume that there's another pipeline from Russia, then Russia accounts for 1/3 of imports into China in the kind of early 2030s. And the other big LNG suppliers are the US, Australia, which again, geopolitically could be problematic from a Chinese point of view, and Qatar. So having another supplier in that mix would certainly be a good thing. And again, diversity is key. So I think there's clearly opportunities there, but I do think that the operating environment in China has become much more complicated for foreign investors.
Thank you, Mikhail. Kasugi, maybe I could come to you. In terms of the broader Asian perspective, what about, where do you see the opportunity for Canada and Canadian investors and suppliers and manufacturers, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, as I said, the Asian economy and the population will continue to grow. And so they would continue to need more energy, either renewable, but also in terms of the fossil fuels, in particular, the natural gas. And if for the Asian economies, I think that one of the important elements is that how they can reduce the dependence on coal and move to kind of a renewable-based, the system with more renewables and supplemented by the natural gas in order to provide a kind of flexibility to the energy systems. So in that respect, I think that Canada has a lot of role to play in terms of supplying the demand, the growing demand in Asian economies, in particular those in the kind of emerging economies like the ASEAN countries or India or those Southeast regions, and of course also to China.
Thank you, Kasugi. And then over to you, Rachel. Any thoughts in terms of the overall Canadian perspective?
So I think the other panelists have covered a lot of it, and Lisa did as well, sort of earlier in the discussion. I also think there is, seconding sort of what Mikhail just said about clarity and providing more information about the work that's been done to reduce this sort of life cycle emissions. Also, I think counteracting and providing sort of clarity on particularly the pipeline issues. And Lisa rightly highlighted some of the things that are coming to market. And Canada's not the only place where it can be difficult to build, sort of to get some of the infrastructure projects built. But I do think there is that view sort of in Asia, particularly from some of the entities that have tried to invest in. So sort of clarity on sort of the process and clarity on what things might go ahead and what won't. Because I think from a business perspective, especially, really important just to know what's a no-go and what regulations would change. And that's where I think some clarity and maybe some slightly different messaging, coordination in cabinet around things like what are business cases for not only sort of natural gas, but oil, as well as I think sort of clarity on the critical mineral side. I do think there's potentially also opportunities given Canada's expertise, not only in, sort of in fossil fuels, but also in the critical mineral supply chains. There are, especially Southeast Asian countries and others, where there might be coordination and sort of collaboration in that way. I mean, not only, there's not been a lot of sort of Canadian presence in a meaningful way in places like Indonesia, but it might be somewhere to sort of, watch and sort of think around. Hopefully not get sort of trapped with the changes in rules and regulation and royalty regimes. But there could be some dynamics there. I didn't say it earlier when I was talking about the IRA, but I'm also watching closely what might be signaled in maybe the fiscal statement later this week, whether there might be sort of measures here in Canada, not specifically on Asia coordination, but on whether there are incentives along those lines to sort of further some of the rollout and Canada's own position in sort of strengthening the grid and the sort of energy infrastructure more generally.
Thank you. And Lisa, maybe I can come to you in terms of Canada's, the opportunity for Canada, and maybe I can ask you the question a little bit differently. What are we doing? Like, what are you seeing out there in the market? What are you seeing out there in terms of, Canada pivoting and responding to the changed world that we've seen?
Maybe I'll take two tacks on that. First, we have seen, in Canada, significant investments from Japan, South Korea, and China made into Canada's upstream natural gas and oil sector, as well as West Coast LNG. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll see in the next 2 years Canadian LNG flowing to Asia, and I really do believe that's just the start. And to your comment earlier, that's not just a pitch; it's a fact. And, I do believe Canada has what I have is an obligation to make every effort to expedite the building of world-class LNG industry to serve East Asia and other nations around the globe. The second point I would say we in Canada really need to pay attention to, and I say this having spent over a third of my career working on a global leadership team of one of the top 10 retirement funds in the world, is we really have to put our head above the parapet and look at the competitive landscape. I talked earlier about the and with that institutional investor lens, with that institutional investor lens, the upstream industry will be, whether people want to believe it or not, a critical piece of the solution to the energy transition. And, not enough attention is being paid to what's happening here in Canada in terms of the global leading innovation and technology to take carbon out of production. And somebody mentioned the US IRA and the incentives to facilitate that. Those are the kind of things that policymakers, both federally and provincially here in Canada, really need to pay attention to, because capital flows are global, and it will go to where there are the most incentives and the greatest rates of return. And Canada has an opportunity here to seize that global thought leadership in GHG emission technology and innovation, and keep all of that alpha here at home, or we can cede it to other jurisdictions like the US. So, those would be my two closing thoughts.
Thank you, Lisa. Really well said. Over to you, Rachel, for some closing thoughts.
I don't think there's too much left to say. We're standing between you all and drinks, but I guess I would just leave with, both something that I'm watching really in the next couple months, which is what, we started with at the beginning. I think Kaisuke-san sort of highlighted this, this sort of rollout of the sort of EU embargo and those sort of oil sort of price caps. It's not something that necessarily hits the radar as much here in Canada as it does sort of either in the US or in sort of but in Asia, but I think there are the kind of disruptions that sort of might come and also just watching whether there are sort of significant shifts in the shipping fleet and other dynamics, a role potentially for Chinese insurance and financial sort of providers to take a different role. An interesting question mark there, even sort of just sort of watching how it might reshape not just flows, but some of the entities and financial actors operating here. I'm not saying it's going to change on a dime, but something to watch, both to sort of think about risks, but also maybe what partnerships there might there might be with trying to sort of maintain the kind of high standards that we've been talking about. Ultimately, actually, I'll stop there. We can talk more over drinks.
Lots to unpack, and know, just your mention of the insurance industry, that's a whole, like a week-long conference to me in terms of just shipping, shipping insurance. Over to you, to Kaseke, if you have any final thoughts, and then I'll come to you, Mikkel, and then I'm going to come back to you, Lisa, just because, just to give you a few minutes at the end as well. Over to you, Kaseke.
Well, the topic is so broad, so I don't know what to conclude. There are so many kind of issues they raised on the table in today's panel. So thank you very much for including me in this. It was very interesting. There is a talk about the kind of the additional LNG from Canada, and I think that's a very important, because when we look at the global LNG markets, the amount of additional LNG coming into the global market will be very limited. And that is because of the kind of a lack of kind of a very low level of investment several years ago. So, it takes years for the LNG projects to be completed. So in that respect, any additional LNG would be a great help for the global natural gas supplies. And also there are many talks about the critical minerals, and I think that's a very important element. And at this moment, there is a very strong presence of China in terms of kind of the resources and also kind of a refinement processing of those critical minerals. For instance, in terms of the battery, I understand that both cathode and anode, China has something like 80 to 70% of share. And also, we released the solar PV report earlier this year, and it shows how the manufacturing capacity are concentrated in China. And I don't say that this would be an immediate threat, but I think that the diversity is a very important part of this the supply chain of those critical minerals. And we don't need to exclude China, because we will see massive growth of demand toward these critical minerals as we see a lot of more EVs or the wind turbines or the solar PVs in the global energy systems. So what is important is make sure that there are kind of a diverse sources, and there are diverse resources. So it's really important to make sure that those resources are developed in a very kind of a diverse manner. And countries can kind of produce, establish the very well diversified and robust and resilient supply chain systems for the critical minerals. And that's one of the kind of the point that we are looking into further at the IEA. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kaseke. Over to you, Mikkel.
I mean, Rachel had opened the Pandora's box of insurance. I'll throw de-dollarization of commodity trade in there and leave that for you for the drinks. But I do want to come back just very briefly on your question of does the current crisis slow or accelerate the energy transition? And I'd love to end on an optimistic note. And I think there are reasons to be optimistic that this will happen. As I said earlier, I think we need to be careful about over-politicization of flows, of this kind of bifurcation of trade flows for both fossil oil and gas, but also for new materials. An industrial policy view of the energy transition is probably a good thing. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US is a good thing because it is a race, hopefully, to the top rather than to the bottom. I think it's also a good thing that gas is part of the debate. I remind you, COP26, there were no oil and gas companies. And I think it is important that fossil fuel, it is part of the transition and that it will be part of the debate. But again, how entrenched is it in Europe? Are we seeing contracts signed that last through 2040? And what are the implications of that? So again, there are kind of two sides to every story. High prices, I think, is sort of common consensus that they help the kind of switch or the energy transition. But I do think that policies will need to help and support this. Things like permitting need to accelerate, because just like LNG won't come online overnight, neither will all these renewable resources come online overnight. They need support. I think there's also been another interesting question, which is the role of markets. In Europe, the markets are the bogeyman. TTF, which is conveyed supply-demand balances, is now seen as the culprit. And I think there is a big question about the role that markets play, not just in fossil fuels and in trading, but also in the energy transition. How much of we do want strong policy signals, but I think we also want mature and transparent markets. And maybe a final point, that obviously the low carbon transition is not going away, and this is a bit unfortunate to say, but I think that extreme weather events will keep this on the table, certainly for developing economies, but for developed economies as well. And so we just have to keep doing it, and we have to find solutions to do it that incorporate, again, both fossil fuels, but also governments and corporates and the financial sector. I'll stop there, but also just thank you very much for including me in this fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Miguel. Excellent points. Over to you, Lisa. Any final brief additional thoughts?
I guess I would just say, wrap it up under what I said earlier before. It's not an either or choice. We can deal with energy security and climate change concurrently. But I would also say, all credible forecasts say that, oil and gas are going to be needed in the years ahead. So what's the best path to get us on the energy transition? And, to quote David Potter from Scotiabank in the Globe and Mail this last weekend, the world has to look for responsible producers for our energy needs. And Canada has the expertise and the capital to produce and export more LNG and other responsibly produced energy. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Lisa. Ladies and gentlemen, it is 6:16 and nobody's throwing any eggs or anything. So thank you. Please join me in thanking, particularly our panelists who joined us from Europe, but join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And we will see, I think we'll see everyone outside. I'm not sure if someone's going to direct us. Terrific. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. With that, we conclude day one's discussions and day panels. Thanks to all of the participants, all the moderators. I think we had a really robust set of discussions across a huge range of issues that will continue tomorrow morning, starting at 9 o'clock with a keynote discussion around Taiwan as a strategic challenge in the Asia Pacific. I encourage everybody to show up on time. It's going to be a great discussion with Oriana Schuyler Mastro from Stanford, so we're very lucky to have her